Hey guys, today I'm in Dream Car Builder and I want to try making a hovercraft. So let's get right into it. So I'm starting off in the sandbox like I normally do in most games, and I'm making an oval shape here, and this is just going to be the basic structure for the hovercraft. So after getting that oval basically made, I also decided to move the driver from the front of the hovercraft on top of it. And this is because I don't want him sitting in front of the thing while it's moving, I want him sitting on top of it. So after positioning him exactly where I want him to be on top of it, I decided to make, I'm going to call it like the inner oval, and this is going to be the top of the hovercraft where he can sit, or I guess other stuff could be in like supplies or whatever. So I just made that there, and now I gotta connect the top part to the bottom part, and I'm doing that just by having a bunch of framing pieces. And now if I give it a test, you can see the structure holds together fine. The guy is bouncing up and down a little bit though. So what I do is just extend out the frame of the hovercraft, and this also have more room for the propellers, and I support the guy so he doesn't bounce up and down as much. And this is where my design deviates a little bit from how a hovercraft works. So normally a hovercraft will work by having an area of high pressure underneath the craft that produces lift, but there isn't any pressure mechanics in this game, so my solution is just to have two propellers pointed straight down producing thrust. Now it is a little different, and it'll actually allow me to get way off the ground and I can fly it around almost like a normal plane, but it should look pretty similar when I have it near the ground. So here you can see the plus sign shape I have, and this is going to be for the propeller. And you see the rectangle shapes I have there, and those are going to be the blades. They're basically, like I said, just rectangles slightly rotated. So I got to put one on each of the blades, and after getting two in, I reinforce them just by putting some framing pieces attached to each opposing corner, and then just got to put in the last two blades. And after getting that done, I just need to reinforce it a little bit, because if I tried just running this now, it would just completely fall apart. So I just gotta connect all the bottoms of the blades together, and this should hold shape. And then if I use a single framing piece to attach it to the body of the hovercraft, it'll load in with it. And you can see it works, it holds together, but it's flexing quite a bit. So to fix that, I just put in a bunch of framing pieces connected to the top of each of the blades. But it still has that flexing problem. So I go ahead and connect all the bottoms of the blades together, and also connect the bottom of each of the blades to the top of each of the blades that are next to it. And after doing that, you can see it's much more stable now. It's not flexing like it was before. So just to finish it off, I put on the panels that are going to create the air resistance, and then just need to increase their lift coefficients so that they'll produce lift. And then finally here, just to give it one last test, you can see it works just like it did before, and it's time to put it on the hovercraft. So I just deleted the framing piece that was temporarily connecting the propeller to the rest of the body, and then connected up the propeller to the body with the nodes that I made before. And you can see it's rotating a little bit there, but I was a little worried it was going to be unstable, so I decided to also make a connection point to the bottom of the propeller as well. So I just had to make that with a few framing pieces on the bottom of the propeller, and then connect up that node to the rest of the body. And now to give it a quick test, you can see the propeller is rotating just a little bit, so it should still be able to rotate freely, but should be more sturdy. And to get the propeller to spin up, I was going to have a jet at the end of the propeller, and I'm putting in that jet right here. And I was only going to have one. I was hoping I would at least be able to see it get off the ground before I put in the second jet and everything, but it ended up just being way too unstable, and you can see how the body is just moving around there. So I decreased the pitch of the propeller, and also added in a jet to the front as well, just to balance things. And now you can see the body's not vibrating back and forth a ton, and I decided just to kind of send it and see what would happen. And it actually managed to lift up the back of the body. Now, you can see the rest of the frame sort of crumpling in on itself a little bit, and I'm just going to need to strengthen it up a little bit. And the fact that I was getting lifted at all was incredibly encouraging. And here I'm strengthening the body, like I said before, and to do that, I just need to create a bunch of beams connecting the left side of the body to the right side, and then a bunch of cross beams to strengthen it. And now if I give it another test, you can see the propeller can still get the body off the ground, but it's not crumpling in on itself, which is nice. Now to get it to lift straight up, and not just lift up the back of the body, I'm going to add in a second propeller. And to do that, I just got to copy, paste it to the front, and then connect it up to the frame the exact way the back one's connected. And you can see how they're both able to rotate freely here. And finally, I just decided to punch it and see what would happen. And I got off the ground, which I was expecting, but it was actually pretty stable, which I was not expecting. Now it's moving to the right, and I have no way to control this at all, but I was expecting it just to flip over or something. So the fact that it's actually lifting in a way that's not uncontrollable was really encouraging, and I was hoping that meant I wouldn't have to tune it a ton to get it to not just instantly flip over or something. So as I said, I have no way to control this, so I wanted to work on that now. And I'm doing what I did before just by having a node ready to go so that once I make a propeller, I can put it on that node. And I'm making the propeller in the same way I did before, except it's just facing a different direction. So after getting my basic plus sign shape done, I worked on the rest of the framing pieces, which was the exact same process as before, so I didn't want to show it. But I finished it off just by putting in a bunch of the panels, and I increased their lift coefficients too, I just didn't show that. And then finally I have to connect it up to the body of the plane in the same way I did before, and putting jets at the end of it too, to spin it up. Now I have these jets on a different keybind so that I can move forwards or backwards independently of if I'm trying to lift it up or not. But when I go to test it, it's now too heavy to get off the ground. And to fix this, I just need to change the weight and hardness of all of the framing pieces to 1 instead of 10. And I also moved the back propeller down just because it seemed unnecessarily high. And with those changes, it was pretty easily able to get off the ground. Now, it's not the most controllable thing ever, and also it did this thing where it seemed to just sort of spin out like this. Now, my initial thought was that maybe it had something to do with the weight distribution. I didn't really think that was the problem, but I guess it was possible, and it was also a really easy thing to fix just by increasing the weight on the front of the hovercraft. So you can see it's totally stable when I'm just lifting it up, but as soon as I turn on the back propeller, it seemed to just torque on the hovercraft and cause it to spin out. So to fix this, I just decreased the pitch of the back propeller, and also inverted the directions of all of the blades. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can spin this second propeller in the opposite direction of the first one, still create thrust in the same direction, but the torques of the two propellers rotating should cancel out, and I shouldn't be rotating the body of the plane at all. So I have that here, and you can see I'm still able to move backwards and forwards, but still when I'm in the air, it keeps rotating, and it's always in the same direction too. Now this made me think it probably had something to do with the bottom propellers. While the bottom propellers might seem like they should be independent of the roll of the craft, I think I found a reason for them to cause the torquing issues. As the propellers move through the air, the wind is interacting with the front of the blades. As it pushes against this blade, the wind is deflected down, producing a torque like this on the propeller. Similarly, as it pushes against this blade, it produces a force this way on the propeller. These forces want to rotate the craft like this, which I think is creating the roll. To fix this, I can invert the blades of the first propeller, which will create an equal but opposite torque from the one in the back propeller, which should cancel out and create no net torque. So now they'll rotate in opposite directions, but they still should produce lift upwards. And you can see that's still working. But here when I tried to give it a quick test, you can see it's still rotated clockwise. Now I think this more had to do with the back propeller sort of just freaking out. And in my second flight here, it was much more stable, but it's still rotated to the side. And finally, when I give it a third test, you can see it rotates in the opposite direction. Now this just makes me think it's probably unstable more than it is just rotating in one direction or another. So it should, for the most part, be a fixed problem, and I'll just need to add in some controls. And I'm adding in some basic hovercraft controls, which are basically just a bunch of paneling pieces that I can move from one side to the other, so I can sort of vent the air where I want and move the hovercraft where I want. Now, this is another case where it's not exactly like a real hovercraft, because normally these panels are going to be interacting with the back propeller, but there is no concept of air movement in this game, so they're just sort of interacting with the atmosphere as a whole. So it does break at times, like when I'm starting from a standstill, but for like the vast majority of the time, it seems like it's about the same thing. And now finally I got them working, and you can see as I move in and out the rod how it goes from one side to the other. I then just had to add in a few paneling pieces like this, and these I turned up the air resistance on as well. I didn't show that though. And as I move them from one side to the other, you can see how they rotate the craft from one side to the other. Now it's extremely back heavy, so it just sort of did a backflip. So I'll have to address that, but first I want to add in some roll control. And for that I basically have two almost squares. And they're loose right now, but if I add some rods to them, and then add some paneling pieces as well, and I'll turn up the air resistance, what I can do is have them go up and down opposite of each other, and this should create roll. And if I give it a quick test here, you can see it does work. I was able to stop myself from rolling in the one direction, but the problem is, I wasn't extremely good at flying it. I got better later on, but if anything was too extreme, I wasn't really able to correct for it in time, but I definitely could tell it was having an effect and it was much easier to fly than it was before. And finally I added in a control for the pitch. I ended up realizing I don't actually need this, because just by varying the bottom propellers, by turning them on and off, I can alter the pitch of the craft. So this back piece is actually unnecessary and at times just works like an air brake to slow down the craft. So I increase the size of the roll panels like that, and this just gives me a bit more authority because it's a little uncontrollable. So I just fixed that, and here if I give it a quick test flight, it's definitely flying extremely well now. It ended up working out pretty well, except for the fact that I turned off the bottom propellers for too long and pitched down too low and fell into the bottom of the mountain. So I got rid of one of the back propellers, because if you remember, I only added that in because I thought it might have been the reason that the aircraft was rolling, but it ended up not being that, and it definitely added more weight and overcomplicated things, so I just got rid of that. And finally, I'm adding in a bunch more framing pieces to smooth out the geometry of the plane a little bit before I add on the paneling pieces. So after doing that, just have to reinforce it with a few framing pieces. And now I gotta add on the panels. And finally, after doing that, I just set them all to be gray. And you can see it looks pretty good, but it's very back heavy now. So to fix that, I just increased the weight of the nose of the plane. And if I give it a quick test, you can see it still lifts off the ground. And I can still fly it around. So I added in, I don't know if lip is the right word here, but I added in like a little lip of just glass pieces to hold the driver in place. And finally, I wanted to add on some wheels. Now, I know real hovercrafts don't have any wheels, but if I want to use it in hovercraft mode, it's going to be off the ground, so if I just want to drive around, I did want to have some wheels for that. So my first 2 suspensions sort of just fell apart, but after adding in 3 separate springs, ended up getting something pretty stable. Now, I didn't love how I was using 3 springs, so I optimized it and also added in some back wheels, and then also just shrunk the wheels into the plane so that you can hardly see them, and then just gave it a quick test flight to make sure that I was still able to get off the ground, which I was. And now finally here, I'm going for a quick test flight. I'm going from this random town to the city. So I guess for some final thoughts on this thing, it's actually not terrible to control. It can be a little bad if you pitch up a little too far. It loses a ton of speed and it can take a little bit for it to regain that. I may be able to fix that by adding in a bit more power to the back propeller, or by increasing the pitch of the back propeller a little bit, but I was happy enough with this and I didn't want to mess with it too much since it seemed like whenever I did that, it just completely fell apart. So now that I'm approaching the city, I wanted to try landing on one of the buildings here. And I picked one of the biggest buildings, so I gave myself the best shot of landing. And after actually getting a pretty decent approach, I landed on it. Now I ended up running the bottom propellers for a bit too long, which flipped it over, but that would have been a fine landing had I not done that. So guys, thanks for watching. I was actually very surprised at how well this thing ended up flying. I thought it was going to be a bit of a disaster and I was going to need a ton of airspeed to get it to be controllable at all, but as you saw, I was like only going at about 35 miles an hour and it was pretty stable, which was surprising. So if you want to see more stuff like this, make sure to subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask below, and otherwise, until next time.